Hi, my name is Katarina Sullivan and I would like to welcome you to my YouTube channel. It is budget week, so it has meant lots of political stuff happening for me, which is awesome. But what does budget week mean for people that don't spend all day watching House of Representatives speeches? Who's talking about me? No one said me. That would be weird. Anyway, budget week is the most wonderful time of year that usually happens in May, but it's happened this year in October because it's 2020 and literally everything has gone wrong in the world this year. So much so that the stuff that is normal is abnormal, and if anything abnormal happens, it's like, oh, that's usual because it's 2020 and everything goes wrong in 2020. And then when normal stuff happens, you're like, didn't you get the memo? It's 2020, guys. Budget week is when the government comes up with a budget or a fiscal plan on how to manage money in Australia in order to improve everyone's lives, is the aim. Depending on who you speak to, they might argue that the budget doesn't or does improve people's lives. It's very difficult because a lot of policy gets involved. In this video, I aim to do a very quick crash course in what is the budget, why did it happen, why does it happen every year, and what does it mean for us, some of the policies that were discussed, and some of the policies discussed in the budget reply, which is also something that we'll cover, what is a budget reply. But then I'll actually do like a proper video on the budget way down the track. But just for today, I had so many people asking me, why are you posting about this so much on social media, and why do I keep seeing this everywhere from all my nerdy friends? Let me answer all these questions for you. Budget, how to manage money. Usually happens in May. Why does it usually happen in May? Our financial year ends on June 30. So they usually try and get everything ready before June, but that didn't happen this year. So it's October and we're having the budget. It's kind of weird, but just roll with it. You may have heard, if you've been tuning into the news, that we are in $1 trillion of debt. This number keeps getting thrown around. $1 trillion of debt, $1 trillion of debt. All the millennials are panicking, so we can't pay this off until 2080. Let me calm you down. It's not $1 trillion, guys. It's 966 billion, firstly. It's almost $1 trillion. We won't actually get into $1 trillion of debt until about 2 or 3 years time. So 2022, 2023 financial year is when that's predicted to happen. Yes, we're looking at about $703 billion by the end of the financial year that we're currently in, so June 2021. But I'm here to tell you that everything is just gonna be okay. So why am I so calm about this $1 trillion? Well, guys, it's only $1 trillion. I don't know about you, but pretty much everyone has that in their bank account. No, they don't. God, I wish I had $1 trillion in my bank account. Please, somebody, if you want to send me $1 trillion to my bank account, my bank details are below. Just kidding, I'm not gonna do that. The world is in a global recession right now. A recession is a temporary period of economic downturn. So the economy is not growing as much as it should, and that is because we have been through not only COVID like the rest of the world, but bushfires and floods and everything else that happened at the beginning of this year that was absolutely insane. Like the flood that happened in the middle of the bushfire in, was it Cooma? So we've been through a lot this year. The best way to get out of a recession is to spend your way out. So unlike a household budget where if you're in a lot of debt, you shouldn't be spending money to get out of debt, a government budget, the best way to get out of debt is to spend your way out. But it's got to be responsibly. You can't just be throwing, millions of dollars on statues. You've got to look at billions of dollars in big nation building, thanks Utopia, infrastructure projects. My political nerds are gonna get that reference and I'm gonna be like, yeah, that's awesome. But it's really important to spend your way out of debt if you're a government so you can actually achieve things and start growing the economy again. So what we're looking at doing is spending money to grow the economy. So in a way, I guess, if you were in a situation where you personally were in debt and you had to drop, maybe $1,000 on a license or qualification to get you qualified for a job that would earn you more money to get you out of debt, then the government debt is kind of similar to that situation. But we're talking trillions of dollars, not just a couple of G's. So it's a full-on situation. The reason I'm not panicking is, firstly, we're doing the right thing by buying ourselves out of the recession. Secondly, our debt as a percentage of GDP is low. We don't need to worry about that so much. We're looking at between sort of like high 30s, low 40s percentage of GDP. I think it's expected to increase to about 43% of our GDP, which is gross domestic product, which is the value used to measure how well a country is performing economically. There are countries around the world where their debt is looking like 150% of GDP, which is insane. Our debt is about 42-43% at most over the projected period. So we're doing okay. Another reason I'm super calm about this is the fact that interest rates are crazy low at the moment. So in the 2018-2019 federal budget, our debt was about 20% of what our GDP was, and equals something like $370 billion. Our net interest payments on that debt were just over $15 billion. In the 2022, there's a lot of twos in that. 2022-2023 financial year, our net debt is predicted to be about $900 billion, which will be approximately 43% of GDP. And our net interest payments should only be about $13 billion, which is $2 billion less than a few years ago when our debt was way lower. Interest rates are crazy low, and they're not really going to rise in terms of the government debt, which I will explain how all that works in a super quick way soon. I'm trying to get like an entire economics curriculum in one video. So our debt interest rate is wicked low right now, which means that this is a perfect time for the government to borrow. So really the government should be borrowing as much as they can right now while those interest rates are low, so we're not paying higher interest later. My eldest bunny is literally death staring me because he's like, this video stuff again, seriously? And now he's just like coming to show off. Ignore him, I'm the star of this show. A question that I've been asked a few times is, who do we owe money to? Like, who are we indebted to? This is where it gets complicated. We have the Department of Treasury, which is a public service government department. So one of the three branches of government. We talk about the legislature, the government, as in like Australian government, so the public service departments, and then judicial. The Treasury is part of the second branch. The Treasury has its own little area called the Australian Office of Financial Management, or the AOFM. This office is in charge of selling government bonds on Australia's behalf. Now, trying to like get through this as quickly as possible, make it really simplistic. Government bonds are kind of like shares. Like you have companies have shares. Government bonds are like the government equivalent to shares in a way. It's basically a way to buy government debt. We will go into this in another video where I'm not going to explain like current policy as well. This is just sort of the quick overview to get us through to the policy. And so you can understand why I'm not panicking about $1 trillion of debt. 966 billion is not a trillion. Foreign investors own about 60% of these government bonds. They are things like hedge funds, foreign banks, wealth funds, insurance, a whole bunch of different kind of organizations buy these bonds. Approximately 40% are owned domestically, and these tend to be superannuation funds, other kind of investment funds, and insurance. These organizations buy government bonds at an agreed upon interest rate. It can be for any period of time. So in the past few months, there's been government bonds being sold for the year 2030, some for 2050. It really varies on who's buying it. And the interest rates at the moment on those are super duper low. We're talking about less than 2% for some, which is awesome. Those interest rates are fixed for that term. So if the AOFM has sold bonds at a fixed interest rate of 1.75% for the year 2050, it's 2050 or 2051 was the one the other day that they sold. That interest rate stays that entire time up until it's paid off. So it's awesome to be doing this at this time because interest rates are so low. So the buying and selling of bonds gets even more complicated when we talk about secondary markets, which is when financial institutions sell on the bonds to secondary people, which is secondary markets. So the Reserve Bank of Australia has been one of the biggest buyers of the government bonds this year because they're trying to keep interest rates low by buying government bonds, but they're buying them from a secondary market, so there's a bit of distance between them and Treasury. And then Paul Keating gets upset about it, who's Australia's former Prime Minister, is like, no, that shouldn't be happening. And then the economists are like, yes it is. And, you know, there's a certain level of my expertise when it comes to these videos, and it ends right about here. I can make so many different policy recommendations about economics and spending and understanding the budget and the deficit and interest rates and bonds. But then when it gets to what the Reserve Bank's doing compared to what the other buyers are doing in these secondary markets, that's when I'm like, welcome to the show, person that knows more than me. There's no one there except my rabbits. No one's coming on this episode. It's important to know that in this situation, there is a lot of people talking about whether or not we're doing this the right way. So I just put my hands up and I'm like, hey Jesus, what's up? It's something that I would be willing to look into more if you do want to know the correct way of doing it, but I'm sure with someone who has been economically so fantastic for Australia, like Paul Keating, and then these chief economists at some of the top firms in Australia saying the same thing, saying different things, that it's really down to personal preference. Let's just hope it works. That is how much debt we're in, why it's okay that we're in that much debt, what the interest rates are, why the interest rates are staying low, what government bonds are, who we owe money to, in a very, very quick video. There will be more about the budget later on when we've got time to sit down, but I really want to get onto policy. I want to talk about some of the government's budget policies as briefly as possible because there's a lot in there. There's an article on my website, which I'll include in the description below, that sort of breaks it down by the global goals, which, as you know, is my passion project that I work on in federal parliament as well as state and local government around Australia, to realize the achievement of the United Nations 17 Global Goals for Sustainable Development, also known as the Sustainable Development Goals. I break it down by goals so you can see what are we doing to address poverty and agriculture and health and education, blah, blah, blah. I've got some of the major policies in that article, which is in my description. One of the main policies that came out of the budget is the JobMaker program, which is targeted at young people. Basically, the government gives $200 to businesses hiring people between the ages of 16 and 29, and $100 to businesses hiring people between the ages of 30 and 35. It's all about getting young people back into work after the pandemic, because there were many young people that lost their jobs, especially retail, hospitality, the list goes on. Clauses has to be for minimum 20 hours of work per week, and the money is available for 12 months from the government to support businesses. I just cracked my finger doing that. I don't know if you heard that, was kind of gross. A few people who are in their older years heading towards retirement are a little bit upset by this policy because it's people at that end of the age spectrum where they're not quite ready to retire, but companies aren't going to be as willing to hire them because they're like, well, how many more years until, you know, they decide it's time to buy a camper van and go around Australia. That's such a stereotype. But also my parents did that when they retired. They didn't get a camper van, but they did do the whole going around Australia thing. So I can make the joke because they did it and it was funny. It disadvantages older people, but it's awesome for younger people. There's a lot of money going into manufacturing, infrastructure, nation building, as I said before, which is really important to get the economy back on track. There is money going into building dams, which I'm super excited about. I really hope that, like, I kind of wish there was more money going toward dam building. It's such a big interest of mine. There's money going to the regions, especially regional tourism, to recover after the bushfire season. I would love to see more money in agriculture, even though agriculture has been doing surprisingly well given bushfires, drought, floods, pandemic. But I'm always such a big believer in more money for agriculture. There's a lot of talk about more money for education. Education is mostly a state responsibility. So whatever state or territory you live in Australia, it's really that sort of level of government that looks after education. Higher education is what's controlled by federal government mostly. They do often do like a stimulus package for primary or secondary schools, but for the most part it's tertiary education that's the focus. There's a lot of energy going into apprenticeships, making sure that young people again have more work opportunities. It's really a long-term plan for young people, but the short term for older Australians is sort of being looked over a tiny bit. There's a bit in there for pensioners, including a couple more stimulus payments, and also an extension of the aged care packages for people who want to remain in the home. Not a lot for aged care facilities. The big one is the tax cuts for about 11 million Australians. Most people are looking at between a G and a couple of G's tax cut. Whenever someone is getting more money, my advice is always save, 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 save your money. Yeah, save that money. Hey. Oh my god, I can't believe I did that. Why did I do that? Anyway, don't save this money. Spend it in the local economy, especially with small businesses in your area. Don't be putting that money into overseas companies. Try and spend it in Australia as much as possible because it is there to support the economy. I cannot give that advice enough. In a recession, yes, you have to save money and be financially savvy, but with this particular money, the whole idea of it is to put it back into the economy. So please look to support small businesses as much as possible. Local businesses, Australian-owned businesses. Just try and keep it here. I know there are countries that are doing it really, really tough, and of course, remain supportive of them, but Australia also needs the money, and when it's coming from the Australian government, we really need to be putting it back into the Australian economy. Another big thing for young people, because I know a lot of young people watch my videos, mental health services are doubling. So previously you could get 10 psychologist visits with Medicare. It's now doubling to 20 psychologist visits, and that is in light of the fact that the pandemic has taken a huge toll on people's mental health, and it's available for all Australians, not just young people, but I'm especially putting it out to young people. There is measure after measure that's been introduced in the budget. I won't go through all of them, just trying to cover sort of the ones that I thought were the biggest news. One thing that I do want to talk about, and it goes into the budget reply. So the Treasurer, who is currently Josh Frydenberg, hands down the budget, usually on a Tuesday night, happened on a Tuesday night, to Parliament. 7:30, you can watch it live on ABC, which I did because I'm such a nerd when it comes to politics. And so he delivers the budget. The opposition leader then does his budget reply a few days later. So Anthony Albanese on Thursday night then turned around and said, these are the things that we're happy with, these are the things we're not happy with, this is what we would do if we were in government. One of the major talking points was women. Women were disproportionately affected by the pandemic. Even though women have been getting back into work at a higher rate than men have been getting back into work since we faced the brunt of the pandemic in most parts of Australia, obviously Victoria is a bit different, it's still not enough to make up for the amount of women that were out of work disproportionately to men. The government had like a $240 million women's economic security statement, and it focused specifically on STEM, which could be seen as a bit of an oversight. When questioned, the coalition has said, well, a lot of these projects are looking to build Australia, and then there was that famous quote of, you know, we're looking at building roads, women drive, don't they? It was said tongue-in-cheek, but then people are like, Liberal MP questions whether or not women are allowed to drive in Australia. Not the context. The context was like, women can drive, like, on the roads for them too. But what's been highlighted is the fact that there's a lot of infrastructure and manufacturing, which typically are male kind of dominated workplaces. So it's like, well, where are the women at though? So Labour had their budget reply and was like, guys, women, like over 50% of the country, those people, yeah, what happened to them? Their focus was primarily on women. I haven't completely gone through the budget reply, not 100%. I know there was one thing in there about universal childcare subsidies, so making childcare affordable for everyone. It's an interesting idea because it's saying we can fix women getting back into the workplace by providing childcare, which for some families doesn't need to be the case because the men stay home. I don't know, it's an interesting one because it's like childcare doesn't really fix the issue of gender inequality if the fact is that gender inequality is caused by the fact that if there is no childcare, it has to be the women that stay home. That's an inherent problem. So it's a weird one. There also then begs the question about middle class welfare, which was a major problem when John Howard was in power, that he did fantastic things for the Australian economy, but then introduced quite a high level of middle class welfare, which is when people in middle class earning bracket are reliant on government money, which could be argued for childcare. There are plenty of people that would be considered in need of childcare subsidy, but then there's some people that probably kind of borderline with it. They don't really need it, but it would be good to have. And it's the same with the tax cuts. When we're talking about putting that money back into the pockets of Australians, do we then become reliant on that money, especially for that middle class and even upper class tax bracket? So there's a lot of things to be really mindful of with middle class welfare and how we come out of the recession, because it tends to be that middle class welfare becomes quite a bit of a trend, and it is the hardest class of people to wean off welfare. A lot of lower income earners are looking to improve their situation, to find a better job, to, you know, if they are out of work, to put themselves back out into the job market and find a job, whereas people in middle class tend to be sort of comfortable where they are. A few of them might push to get a little bit more money, but there's not the same kind of drive as lower income earners sometimes, and so it creates this whole issue with middle class welfare, which is something we're going to be super duper careful. I've got to be careful of the way I say careful. We've got to be super duper careful of, because it's in both the budget and the budget reply. There's quite a bit of that in there. Another commitment from Labour in the budget reply is to do with social housing, because there's an estimated 200,000 people on the wait list for social housing, which is insane. And the government has a slight policy with social housing of providing low-cost finance for builders to build more affordable housing. And I know that there's a lot of people who live on minimum wage who are affording rent, and then there's some that live above minimum wage and aren't affording rent. And then the question sort of like, well, why does that happen? The Liberal Party, or the coalition I should say, isn't as generous with that as what Labour is. Sometimes Labour is a little bit more understanding of people in situations, sometimes borderline too understanding, but then sometimes the coalition doesn't have that same sympathy. So it's sort of like there's issues with both sides. But there's got to be a middle ground, and that's what the aim of politics is to do, is to find that middle ground between being understanding enough that we're not spending all of our taxpayer dollars on social housing for people that might not necessarily need it, and then also being sympathetic and empathetic enough to people who are in situations where they need affordable housing, and for the government to provide that through taxpayer dollars. So that's kind of the fine line that we've got to tread in politics, and I'm trying to be super unbiased and super apolitical and show you both sides of the coin and the positives and negatives to both, because they're both awesome and they both suck simultaneously. And that's the amazing thing about politics. There's also a lot of money going into renewable energy in Labor's budget reply, so about $20 billion, I think the figure was that I saw today, about upgrading the energy grid. In the budget, the Libs are committing, I know about the $2 billion for funding emissions and supporting renewable technologies, but I'm sure there's more in there that I haven't quite read yet. The budget is about 600 to 700 pages. It's a lot to get through. I tried to get through a good chunk of it. I got through about a sixth of it on Tuesday night before I was like, I'm good at bed. What happens from here? Well, the budget has already been passed in Parliament. So when we spoke about the 1975 constitutional crisis a couple of videos ago, we spoke about block of supply, which is when the budget isn't passed in Parliament and the Treasury has no money. So supply hasn't been blocked, which is normal, but also in light of the fact that we did just talk about it, great news to know that we're not going to have another constitutional crisis. The spending will commence. We'll find out how things go between now and 2023 when we get this $1 trillion of debt. Super interesting period. It's going to be tough. Like, we are really going to do it tough over the next however many years, because of the extent of this recession. The things that we have to be grateful for is that we were in a really, really good financial position to begin with, that we have a really stable government, even though it seems tumultuous at times between Rudd, Gillard, Rudd, Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison, leadership spills that happened at the beginning of the year in the National Party, or attempted leadership spills. It didn't actually go through. But all these little things that happen that we see our government as being so unstable, the fact of the matter is that we're not at risk of a military coup or an uprising of like random rebels. Like, we have a very strong legislature section in our government, which means that our bonds are quite valuable, which is why people buy them even during a recession. I say people as in like massive organizations, but we're in a really good position. If you're feeling anxious, I know there's people that have anxiety related to climate change, and I'm sure there's going to be people that have anxiety related to the budget. Please do not feel the need to worry about it. I know with anxiety, sometimes you can't control it, but if you can be reassured of one thing, that as long as we keep growing our economy, we will be fine. To support growing the economy, buy local. As much as you can, buy local, support our local businesses, our local farmers, all of the people that are contributing economically to this country. The more we can do to pump money back into the economy, the more we're going to be okay. That is my one piece of advice and my reassurance to you all that everything's totally fine. Don't worry about it. We've got enough to worry about, not having to worry about the economy. Other things that probably could have been done better in the budget, according to some people, yes, according to others, no. It's really up to your political interpretation, but I think we have a really strong foundation going forward that we're not going to crumble as an economy. It may be harder on some people, maybe easier on others, and reverse. If Labour was in charge, it might be more difficult on the people that was easier on, and easier on the people it's more difficult on. At the end of the day, when we're rebuilding a nation, we can't always make everyone happy. Unfortunately, we're a democracy, so we try to make the majority happy. It is often really difficult to make every single person happy. I would love to hear from you what you think was left out or didn't need to be in the budget and or the budget reply. There will be an article on that next week as well. Drop them in the comments what you think about the budget. Would love to hear it. And if you do have any questions about any of the measures, There's, like I said, pages and pages and pages of budget papers outlining policies. I've written down dot points for a few in that article I was talking about. Go check that out, it's in the description. But if you do have any questions about any of those policies as well, please feel free to ask me and I'll do my best to answer them. Any other politically related questions, budget related, ACT election, Queensland election related questions, let me know and I will also do my best to help out with them. Stay calm, cool and collected. If you live in Canberra, head to pre-polling stations because the election is next week. I promised myself that I wasn't going to ramble for the end of this video, so I'm going to cut it off here saying thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe to my channel, like this video, share it with your friends, follow me on social media. You can still take that survey that I forced you into taking last week if you haven't done it, and I will find you if you haven't done it. That's a lie. I can barely find my glasses when I go out. Let alone find a human. Please do that survey. It would be super, super helpful, both to me and to the federal government and for the work that we're planning to do in the future around political education. And also, please go check out the article about the budget and what I did with that. And I'm ending this really, really quickly, so thanks, goodbye, I love you guys.